Hi, Rupert.
Hi, Simon, and hi, Bernardo. Nice to see you both again.
Nice to see you too as well.
Lovely to be together again. So this conversation follows on from the last one we had, which was entitled, Is Everything Made of Matter or Consciousness? And it was a wonderful conversation. It was a real privilege to be part of it. It had a lovely reaction. A lot of people really enjoyed it. So first of all, thank you to everyone who did listen, did watch, and who left such kind comments. And it was so enjoyable because you both so artfully and surgically dismantled the mainstream model of reality. And so this conversation is about moving the needle forward a bit and asking really the question, so what? And what are the implications for ourselves, for the way we treat each other, for the way we treat the planet, and hopefully many other things as well, of this understanding? If idealism, if the consciousness only model, if non-duality is true, then what does it mean for us? And I'm going to take a bit of a backseat and let you two just crack on and occasionally dive in if the feeling takes me. But let's crack on then. And a good place to start would be actually just a very brief revisit or summary of that first conversation. It may have been 2.5 hours, but do you think you can slim it down to a couple of sentences, Rupert, and then dive in with the first and most important implication as you see it?
Yes. So, a synopsis of the first conversation in a couple of sentences. Behind the apparent multiplicity and diversity of people, animals, and things lies a single, infinite, and indivisible whole or reality, which ultimately cannot be named or described, but we could provisionally refer to it as a consciousness, or in religious language, spirit, or indeed love. So that would be the essence of certainly my contribution to our last conversation. What are the implications of this understanding? This understanding has implications for all aspects of our life. First of all, the implication for our inner life of thoughts, and particularly feelings. If our core self or being is not limited to, contained within, or defined by the content of our experience, thoughts, images, feelings, and so on. If it is a single, infinite, and indivisible whole or reality from which everyone and everything derives its apparently independent existence, then our essential self must be whole, complete, lacking nothing. So that's the first implication of this understanding, is in relation to our feelings: fulfillment, peace, ease, absence of lack, although the common word, of course, happiness. And by happiness, I don't mean that we always have to be laughing and smiling and singing and dancing. I mean, the Buddhists are careful not to objectify this inherent quality of our essential nature. So they don't refer to it in the positive as happiness. They simply refer to the absence of suffering, the absence of lack, the ease of being. So that would be the implication for our inner life, peace. The implication for our external experience in relation to people and animals. Let's take people to begin with. Obviously, whether we like somebody or not depends on the extent to which our conditioning and their conditioning either agree with one another or at least are complementary. So whether we like someone or not is to do with the conditioned aspect of our personality. However, Love is something completely different. It has nothing to do with whether we like someone or not. I would suggest love is the recognition of our shared being or our shared reality. So the implication of this understanding is that we love everyone, irrespective of whether we like them or not, irrespective of whether we agree with their ideas, their politics. That's got nothing to do with whether we love someone. So we're not, in this understanding, we are not called to like everyone, but we are called to love everyone. And to this recognition of our shared being, this feeling of love that we have for everyone, informs the way we relate to everyone. It doesn't mean to say we have to agree with everyone. We may disagree with them. We may disagree with them strongly. But this essential recognition of our shared being informs the conversation or the dialogue or the action that takes place between us. In relation to animals, again, we don't just understand, but we feel that what we essentially are and what all animals essentially are is not a similar being, but the same being, the same reality. And we treat animals accordingly. And indeed, we extend this not just to people, not just to sentient beings, people and animals, but we extend it to everything, because not just everyone, but everything ultimately shares the reality that we essentially are. And therefore, this has profound implications for the way we treat nature, that we do not consider ourselves separate and apart from nature. We are, in spite of the appearance of separation, difference, multiplicity, we are, at our core, literally one with, the same as nature, and we treat it as such. And this would make the exploitation and degradation of the environment almost impossible. In fact, it would make it impossible. So that briefly are the implications in terms of our internal life. One other implication in terms of our exterior life, not only our relationships with people, animals, and the environment, but the work we do, because most people's lives, outer lives, are concerned with activities and relationships. Our activities, in particular, the work we do in the world. The work we do in the world would, one who has this understanding, the implications are that their work, the work they do in the world, would be the means by which they bring this understanding out into the world and share it or express it or communicate it or celebrate it in some form with humanity, in society. So it would have a profound implication for the work we do. So those are the areas, our inner life of feelings, our relationships with people, our relationship with animals, our relationship with the environment, and the work we do. It has profound implications on all these 5 aspects of our lives.
Bernardo?
Well, in characteristic fashion, Rupert has addressed all the key weighty points. I don't feel I have anything to add to those points. What I can do is to talk about some of the more peripheral implications, which for me are gems, because you see, if you're starving, breadcrumbs are a meal. I'm not an enlightened being, so I'm not where Rupert is. I don't want to use this word for Rupert. I know he's not too comfortable with it, but Rupert is in a place that is further ahead. So for me, more peripheral implications have changed my life. Things like what are the implications of this understanding of reality, of nature, for healthcare, for our physical well-being as well, not only our mental well-being. What are the implications for our perception of the meaning of life? What is life all about? Are we here just to go on this dance and then at the end, it's all over and it was for nothing? Or is there some telos, some natural direction? Is there something nature wants to do through you? is there something nature wants to bring into manifestation, into expression in the world through you? That's another biggie, another big implication for me. Things regarding the more or less recent but incredibly damaging Western idea, which is when I say it, people will go like, well, of course, that's obvious, right? It's so ingrained it is that people see it now as self-evident, this Western idea that your life is about you, that my life is about me. Uh, this is astonishingly unnatural. It's wrong from every perspective one can possibly look at it. But it has come to govern the entire industry of self-help, of motivational speakers, life coaches, and whatnot. Everybody makes the assumption that a person's life is about that person. No, a person is a part of nature. A person's life is about what nature is trying to do, what nature is expressing through that person. So, and if you understand this, such a weight is lifted from our shoulders. A tremendously heavy load is just taken out. Your life is not about you. So, you're not a failure if you're not happy. You're not a failure if you didn't manage to tick all the boxes of your life plan that you did when you were 21. That's not what it's all about. And moreover, your plans are just your plans. They are not nature's plans. They're all your own little narrative, your own machination about what should and what should not. And who are you to know? So if your plans don't come true, you're also not a failure, because what's going on is something completely else that flies over the head of Western society today. I could speak for hours about all these little ancillary implications, which for me are like, the berries, because I'm I'm not, and I don't put this pressure on myself either, because again, it's not about me. I'm not in a place where I can live the unity of nature. I know that to be true based on my conceptual reasoning, my look and study of the evidence, scientific and otherwise. But it's not a reality that sort of streams through my body at this point in my life. I know it conceptually mostly. So I sort of dance around the more ancillary implications.
I want to raise an objection there, Bernardo.
I knew you would do that. Your vision of me is higher than my own.
As far as I know, as far as I can tell, Bernardo, you spend every hour or almost every hour of your waking life devoted, dedicated to sharing and expressing this understanding through your conversations and through your writings. So that to me is an expression of one whose mind is not completely clear of personal psychology. Of course, none of our minds are completely, but is sufficiently free of the tyranny of personal psychology to enable its main purpose in life to be the sharing, the communicating, the celebrating, the expressing of truth or reality.
That is true. I have learned over the years to not fight what nature wants to do through me. I know it's a very losing proposition to do that. One, you can't win, and two, you just don't serve your life's purpose. So I'm totally open to what nature wants to do through me. That doesn't necessarily reflect a lived experience of unity, if you know what I mean. But as you know from me, I'm okay with that. It's
Yes,
fine.
yes. But your work, what I perhaps I'm just repeating myself, but your work is an expression of the understanding of unity, and it's quite evident. It's evident to me when I hear you. I think it's evident to so many people that you're not just talking book knowledge, you're not just speaking, regurgitating something you've read. It is your own passionate belief and understanding. In other words, it comes from your experience. Yes, I understand it may not have pervaded all the way through the layers of your experience and washed your experience completely clean of personal psychology. I understand that, but I think I'm still objecting to your claim that what you're doing doesn't come from your lived experience. I feel that it does.
No, I live my philosophy for sure.
Yeah,
I mean, my
yeah,
philosophy. It's not
yeah,
even mine, but you know what I mean. I live that. But the first implication that you talked about just a few minutes ago, and you called it love, and you explained what that means, the direct experience of unity. That's not something that I experience at all times. Um, but again, it's okay.
yes,
I will do what nature wants to do through me, regardless of whether I
yeah,
experience that love or
yeah.
not. It we are in a place in history now where it's very difficult for me to experience that. What's happening in Ukraine is really throwing me out of balance. And anyway, yeah,
Yeah. Can I share relating directly to that, Bernardo? Can I share a practice
please.
that I have, and it's a practice that I do regularly, and I tailor the practice to the moment, and this moment, as you say, we are in a perilous time in human history because of what's happening in Ukraine. So going back to what I said earlier about we're not called to like everybody, but we are called to love everybody. I have a practice, and it involves taking the image of two people, one whom I love deeply and who I like deeply. And I take my son, for instance. That I love him, that I feel one with him goes without saying. But I also like him very much. I then take a second image of someone who I dislike intensely, Vladimir Putin.
Yeah,
Probably, if I had to choose a single character on the planet as to one who I despise, whose activity I despise most vehemently, who I dislike as a character, I would choose him.
yeah, me too.
I hold these two images up in my imagination, and I look at them both, and I feel, in relation to my son, how attracted I am toward how his face. It makes me feel open. I like him. I love him. And then I do the same with Putin, and I feel the resistance that comes up in me, the judgment, the disapproval, the intense dislike. And I keep looking. It's as if I look through the conditioned layer of his thinking, his thoughts, his feelings, and his actions, all of which I detest. But I keep looking until I can see through that, not just understand, but feel that his core subjectivity, his core sense of himself is identical to my son Matthew's, which is identical to myself. And that recognition, the recognition with our core subjectivity is the same subjectivity, that's what I call love. And I keep looking at him. I go back and forth between the two images until I feel the same love for both of them.
I I know you're right. I could hear myself say this exact same thing to my audience many times. Um, it's difficult in the case of this particular character at this particular moment in time, but it's a worthwhile exercise because I know you are right. Yeah.
Can I just ask, Rupert, in terms of then not just Putin, but the situation at large and the possible direction it's going, how do you embrace, the possible consequences?
What I'm suggesting doesn't imply that force is not sometimes required. I think it is.
Yeah.
you don't smile sweetly at people like Putin. Let's bring this a little closer to home. Anyone who is a parent or who has nephews and nieces and knows that if your child does something that is harmful to themselves or others, you say no. They keep doing it. You say no a little bit more strongly the next time. The third time they do it, you're a little bit fiercer. And the fourth time you say, if you do that one more time, I'm going to lose it with you. And of course, they just straight away they do it, and you lose it with them. I lost it with Matt sometimes when he was young, because I tried all the other means and none of them worked. So a display of anger is required, and it always worked. So, in exactly on a much larger scale, diplomacy is obviously the first avenue that we should try. We should try it once. We should try it twice. We should try it again. We should keep on trying it until we're absolutely sure that we have exhausted all possibilities. But then, if it doesn't work, then more stringent measures are necessary in service of truth, which means in service of peace, love, justice, tolerance, compassion, and sometimes force is necessary. So I'm not answering your question specifically, Simon, but I have no problem with escalating the extent of the force that we use in the West to counter this threat, which is not just a threat to Ukraine. It's a violation of truth. It's a violation of the single principle of truth, namely that we are one. There is a single reality, and we should take whatever means are necessary to combat and prevent that, including force.
I completely agree with this. I think at least some of my audience sometimes misunderstand this position. They say, well, to express evil is also part of nature. It's also part of the universal mind, which is correct. But it is also part of the universal mind, also part of nature, to strive against evil, to stop evil, and sometimes forcefully if need be, because you're not just going to wait for evil to come and barbarize your loved ones and violate truth left and right. I think what this understanding calls for is not the complete cessation of the use of force when force is the last resort that we have at our hands. What it calls for is the end of the notion that the use of force is a form of vengeance, and that's what has to be clear. The judicial system in the U.S., at least today, is largely based on vengeance. During sentencing, the family of the victims are brought in to express their anger towards the accused or the sentenced, and you get this intertwining notion of vengeance and punishment. And I think that is wrong. That's the wrong motivation. I think vengeance and punishment have no place in the dance of nature. But the use of force is still required, one, as a deterrence, and two, as a neutralization of a source of harm. So it's not at all about vengeance. It's not at all about saying that that person had individual responsibility for the crimes, even if that person didn't have individual responsibility because of his genetic makeup, his education, his traumas, whatever. Even in that case, that person is still a potential source of harm, a proven source of harm, and the ability of that person to inflict harm must be neutralized. And that's why you lock that person up, not because you're taking revenge, not because you're inflicting punishment, but because you're neutralizing evil, or the ability of evil to express itself, and you are creating a deterrence in the context of a society that may help others in their calculations about what actions to take or not take. It may tilt the equation towards not taking an evil action because of fear of deterrence. So I think force has its place, but its use has nothing to do with vengeance or punishment. It's a means to stop the unchecked expression of evil.
Yeah. Yes, you could say that vengeance is always a personal or egoic response, whereas the use of force in order to neutralize or deter would be force in the service of impersonal truth,
Yeah.
force in the service of truth or love, rather than in service of the individual.
Yeah, and in that context, I think it's perfectly applicable in Ukraine now. They are being invaded.
Yes, one could even, I think, I would sometimes go further and say that not to act in such a situation with force, if required, to restore as a deterrence, a neutralization. In other words, to restore truth, harmony, justice, and so on. Not to act in such a case would be the egoic response. It would be a response that came from the fear of an individual. That it would be cowardice. It would be refusing to act, washing a veneer of non-violence over one's egoic fear, justifying egoic fear, saying, "Oh, it's wrong to be violent. This is an understanding in which non-violence is implied." No, that would be washing a veneer of non-dual philosophy over what is in fact an egoic response, a fearful response that comes from the preservation of the individual, that doesn't arise on behalf of the whole.
Here. Simon, I hope you publish this one quickly because it's very, very relevant for the present time.
Yes. And obviously, we're not here to talk about Ukraine, but just a final point on it that I imagine some people may think, which is obviously if action in that way was taken, we know what is being threatened. We know what is on the table, which, to some degree is nuclear annihilation. What about that within this then? Because perhaps it's not just a sort of personal fear, but an understanding that what's at stake.
Okay, I'll try to start. Look, it is true that certain expressions of nature, such as the Kremlin's government today, are disposed towards limiting the expression of nature, because nature expresses itself through the personal dispositions of living beings and what they want to do with their lives. So it's a key condition for nature to express its potentialities is some degree of individual freedom. But it is true, and that's also part of nature, that some of the expressions of nature want to stop this freedom, want to put an end to this freedom. But if those limiting expressions are allowed to have their way, then the game as a whole will be impaired, because there will be limits on nature's ability to express itself in many other ways. In other words, people will not have individual freedom. And I think individual freedom is a teleological means to whatever nature is in the process of trying to achieve, or trying to get to whatever understanding it's trying to get to through us. So to allow a Putin or any other totalitarian dictator to use the threat of total annihilation in the form of nuclear war is almost as detrimental to the expression of nature as nuclear war. Maybe I'm exaggerating this a little bit, but I want to convey the sense that not doing something to stop that tide of limiting freedom is not natural. It's limiting to whatever natural telos there may be to existence. So if we don't do anything, what will happen is that whoever has the nuclear weapons will realize that they can get away with anything, and therefore they will do anything and limit nature's expression. Can we afford that? I don't think that we can. I think that we cannot allow the possession of nuclear weapons to be such a powerful superpower for a state that that state can get away with anything it wants to do, with whatever freedoms it wants to limit and cap, and whatever destruction it wants to inflict. If we do that, that's already the end. We will survive, but not live. I think we should live, not merely survive.
Rupert?
Yes, I don't have much to add to that. I agree that with Bernardo that if our essential nature or being is the one undivided whole whose nature is consciousness, then at the deepest level, we are that consciousness is free. It is free from any of the subsequent limitations of human experience. And this is why all people, without exception, love freedom. It's why all human beings seek freedom. It's not a random thing. It's because at the deepest level, even if we don't formulate it in these terms, each of us knows, each of us feels, each of us believes that freedom is our birthright. It's not something we should earn. It's not something that we should have if we behave in a certain way, or if we have a certain degree of intelligence or a certain degree of wealth. No, freedom is our nature. It is our birthright. And therefore, this telos that you spoke of, Bernardo, everything and everyone ultimately is going towards that sooner or later, because the individual, being an apparent contraction of the universal, is always tending to return to its natural condition. And our love of freedom is one of the ways that we, as apparently limited beings, return naturally to our original condition. And therefore, the any action that we do in service of this freedom is an expression of that freedom, of that whole, and is legitimate. And we should, I agree with Bernardo, we should be very, very wary of allowing fear, in this case, fear of nuclear war, to deter us from acting appropriately in the service of freedom.
Okay. Just to get things somewhat back on a more neutral territory, Rupert, you said at the start, to love everyone, to recognize that shared being. And you gave that lovely example of the practice that you do, bringing to mind your son and someone you dislike. But you said the most important thing is to feel that same being. Can you just talk a bit about that?
Yes, it's relatively easy for all of us to acquire this understanding that we're speaking of here at a rational or intellectual level. It makes good sense, and I'm not in any way demeaning that. That is itself the understanding is a considerable achievement in our culture today. But it's another thing to feel it. In a way, it's we have to take the understanding into our hearts, out of our minds and into our hearts, so that not just our thoughts are aligned with this understanding. We don't just think in a way that is consistent with this understanding, but our emotions, our feelings are consistent with it. And then in time, our actions and relationships in the world are an expression of this understanding. So I think that feeling this is it's the deeper aspect of understanding. It's when understanding comes out of I don't mean this literally, the head and the heart, but I think you understand the context. It's when the understanding comes from our head into our heart. It penetrates more deeply into us, because really it's our feelings that govern the way we act and relate. Feelings override our thinking in most cases.
Bernardo, do you have anything to add to that, or shall I?
Very briefly, sometimes I feel, Rupert made a disclaimer, I don't mean this literally. Sometimes for me it feels quite literal. It comes down my throat, I feel
Yes.
it in the body, and it sinks into the chest, and
Yes.
there is a kind of warmth and vibration. It's very hard to explain, but it's almost, I think it, for me at least, it's almost literally that, this sinking into the body.
I mean, a lot of people do talk about kind of an opening of the heart. Actually, I watched a documentary about some people who were doing, seem to have really embraced this understanding through Qigong. And they spoke about this, it really penetrating their body, first and foremost, through the heart, an opening of the heart. Because obviously when you talk about feelings, it's difficult to perhaps for some people to really understand what that means in terms of understanding. Is it just a feeling of love? It's how we feel when we do love someone, but we feel that exponentially and totally.
It's interesting that you mention Qigong, Simon, because that's a practice which is primarily a physical practice. It starts with a physical, although there is a deep understanding behind it. But you don't start off exploring your beliefs. You start moving, and that has an impact. It has a direct impact on the way we feel, and only later do we rationalize the experience. Most people, I would say, most of the people that I speak to consider these ideas rationally first, and only later do they sink into the body and penetrate our feelings. And then again later are they expressed in our actions and relationships. But Qigong is a very good example of a practice that doesn't start with exploring beliefs or investigating the nature of the self or investigating reality, but it starts with a movement practice which opens the heart, and then later may or may not be rationalized.
I'm asking more questions than I planned to, but I'll continue just for the moment. So, obviously, as you said, most people come to this understanding and understand it and read about it and watch YouTube videos, etc., and get that understanding. And then, so what is that process then of it going from the head to the heart? How can one hurry that along?
I'm sure Rupert will have a much more suitable answer than me. This has happened, not all the way, but it has happened to me. And to be very honest with you, I don't know how it happened. It just happened. I arrived at certain conceptual conclusions from just thinking about things logically and trying to examine my hidden assumptions and getting rid of them and replacing them with better inferences about what might be going on, and looking at laboratory evidence of all things from foundations of physics and the neuroscience of consciousness. And at some point, that story ties up so well. It is so neat. It avoids all the pitfalls that philosophy falls into in these days. That it, it, it's not a matter anymore of a hypothesis. You understand that, yeah, that's what's going on. It's not a big theory about all the dynamics of nature. It's an understanding about what nature is in essence, and it's an understanding that it's extremely compelling. And once you get to that full, unreserved conceptual acceptance that your conclusions are sound, over time, at least with me, they sunk in. And they started coloring everything. One of the biggest changes was a tremendous increase in the degree of empathy and compassion, a felt understanding that my life is, again, not about me. And when I say this, I don't mean that I am irrelevant or that you are irrelevant or that people are irrelevant. On the contrary, we are instruments, and critical instruments for nature. But what you do with an instrument is not about the instrument. The instrument is a means to something. And that's what I think, and what I feel in my body, that my life is all about. It's not about me. I am an instrument. And it's precisely therein that I feel the meaning of my life, this inevitable meaning that whether I see it or not, whether I believe it or not, whether I like it or not, it's there. My life is just bursting at the seams with meaning because it's not about me, because it's about something bigger, much more encompassing than I am. And I'm just playing a tiny role in it. And that tiny role is what gives me this um, existentialist peace, peace in the existentialist sense, in the sense that I no longer, I used to many years ago, but I no longer wake up in the morning thinking, why am I alive? What am I doing? This is all for nothing. And then staying in bed because what I'm about to do has no meaning to me. That's gone. That place in the mind is a place I haven't visited in a very long time. So yeah, and why haven't I visited that? Because somehow my conceptual analytic understanding of what's going on has sunk in. If you ask me, how did that happen? How can people speed that up? I don't know. I don't know.
Rupert, I bet you've got an idea.
I've got an idea, but it's much easier to talk about how this understanding penetrates the way we think, because then we can explore beliefs and we can subject those beliefs to the scrutiny of reason, evidence, experience, and so on. It's much less easy to describe how this understanding penetrates the way we feel, because it's not a rational process. That our feelings they lie below the threshold of rational scrutiny. They're not susceptible to rational scrutiny. So it's the means by which this understanding penetrates our feelings is far less clinical, less rational, less linear, less directed. The analogy that I sometimes use, it's a very imperfect analogy, but it suffices for this, that if the ego or the apparently separate self is considered not an entity in its own right. Of course, the only entity, if we can call it an entity, is the whole, infinite consciousness. But if the ego or separate self is an apparent limitation of that whole, made of beliefs and feelings, then the sense of separation or the ego is dissolved. That the beliefs and feelings that constitute the separate self or ego is dissolved by the whole. In relation to our feelings, that this involves subjecting our beliefs, our ideas to the scrutiny of reason. But at the deeper level, it's a same process, but it's irrational. So to get to the analogy, it's like take a dishcloth that you have in your kitchen, and it's you use it every day for a week, and it gets dirty through the week. Then you wash it. Washing it takes out 90% of the dirt, but there are ingrained stains which are impregnated in the cloth that don't come out with washing. You have to leave the cloth soaking in hot soapy water for the water to penetrate deeply into the fabric of the cloth and slowly dissolve those stains out. You can't scrub them out. Well, the feelings are a bit like those ingrained stains that can't be scrubbed out by rational thinking. That it involves immersing oneself in this understanding, allowing this understanding to penetrate deeply into our feelings. Because for anyone who is deeply interested in truth, the discrepancy between our thoughts and feelings is intolerable. If we think something and we feel another way, and even more, we act and relate in another way, that, for someone deeply interested in truth, that discrepancy, that contradiction is intolerable. Sooner or later, it becomes intolerable, and we become very sensitive to anything in us, in our feelings, our actions, that contradict our genuine understanding. So I'm not really answering your question directly, Simon, other than to say that it's a gradual penetration of the deeper layers of the psyche and the body, the penetration of our feelings in the body by this felt understanding.
Rupert, things you say, and this happened again, you tend to unlock things in my mind when I listen to you. So you unlocked two things, but one is appropriate in this context. So I just wanted to quickly share it. Maybe just life has the tendency to do that. Just life, going through the motions of life, the ups and downs of life. Because at least in my case, these motions of life made me realize that I can be many different states in the mind. If you visualize the mind or consciousness, when I use the word mind, I don't mean thoughts. I'm still attached to the Western tradition. I mean phenomenal consciousness when I use the word mind. So if I visualize metaphorically the mind as the vastness of space, different feelings or even different dispositions, different understandings, different motivations to action, personality traits, thoughts and opinions. These are all different places in that space, different places in the mind, different rooms that you visit over time. And life has, at least in my case, has done this to me to understand my own anxieties, my own dispositions, personality traits, opinions, visions, and all that as places in the mind. When I have certain dispositions, I am in one place in the mind. When I have another kind of understanding, I am in another place in the mind. And if you've seen this enough in your own case, it becomes so easy, so self-evident to understand that what other people are is you in another place in the mind. Know what I mean?
Yes.
It's the same subject in another place in the mind, in a parallel timeline.
Yes.
So it's not like you will be in that place in the mind in the future. No, you are there right now because you're in a parallel timeline. It's the same you in another place in the mind. And once that understand comes in, then you truly see other people as you, not the me, not the ego you, but the subject that experiences the world through a different perspective, because that subject can be in many different chambers in the palace of mind. And once that happens, at least in my case, conceptual understanding sort of transmuted into this immediate apprehension of other people as me in another chamber in the palace of mind. Truly me. And then notions like vengeance and punishment, they disappear, but not force against evil, because I know I'm very dangerous when I am in that other place in the mind, and I need to stop myself when I am in that other place in the mind.
Yes. Yes. So you could say, Bernardo, I'm just kind of, the image that you've just given you could say that an individual's thoughts take place sequentially in time, but other people are like thoughts, like the thoughts we have in our own mind, but they take place consecutively in space.
Yes, and actually, there is a world-renowned physicist working on this. That's Professor Bernard Carr from Queen Mary University in London. Somebody you should meet, Rupert.
Funnily enough, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Bernardo. I did a conversation with a group recently in America. And to my surprise, it was a small group and they were mainly scientists. To my surprise, he was one of the attendees. And we had a conversation. And I not only recognized him, I recognized the name. And I very much liked our conversation. And I thought afterwards, gosh, I must get in touch with him. But this conversation has now triggered that memory. I think I will, especially if you say he's working on this idea, because the idea that an individual's thoughts happen sequentially in time within their own individual mind, but other people are simply thoughts that happen consecutively in space.
In a parallel timeline, you could look,
In fact, I did go even further to say that they don't happen in space, but that the illusion of space is created to accommodate two simultaneously appearing thoughts. Because in our own individual mind, if there was only one dimension of time, we couldn't have two thoughts at the same time. That's why they have to be separated, and their separation, if there's only one dimension, the distance between these two thoughts is called time. But if there can be two thoughts occurring simultaneously, then in what is the space that is going to accommodate them? Not time, because they happen at the same time. There have to be another space in order to... Perhaps that's what physical space is.
You nailed it. You nailed it. So, so Simon, may I elaborate on this a little more?
Please.
Physicist Lee Smolin from the Perimeter Institute, he has proposed this notion that you can reduce space to time. So this spatial separation is actually at the root level, if Lee is correct, temporal separation.
Yes.
And then the difficulty of seeing another as yourself disappears. The other is you in the same sense that your past self was you and your future self will be you. So another self in space is just like your past self or your future self or your future
Yes.
self. It's still you. And this idea came to my mind for the first time. I was still a child and I watched my father play chess against himself. Because before the time of computers and engines, if you were a chess student, that's how you did it. So my father would play a move with white, then stand up, go to the other side of the table, and then play a move with black, and then stand up and go to the other side. So the way I pictured it was the following: if I could chop off the moment in which my father was on the black side and chop off the moment in which my father was on the white side, and then sew together all the whites and sew together all the blacks, then it's still my father, but now my father is truly playing against himself in parallel timelines.
Yes.
See what I mean?
Yes.
And one way to understand why I am you and you are Simon and everybody's one is this: chop it up down to an infinitesimal microscopic level and then sew these together in a self-consistent way. And then I am you for the same reason that my father was playing black and white. But when you chop it off and sew together the whites, my father playing white in that parallel timeline would have the impression that he was always playing white, because the experience of playing black was chopped off and the surrounding experience of playing white were sewed together. So there would be a continuity in the white and a continuity in the black. So my father playing white would say, I'm the one playing white. I'm not the guy playing black, because I have this continuity in this timeline
Yeah.
in which I've been playing black all along. And the guy playing black or white, whatever, would have the same thought, but it's both my father. And Bernard is trying to formalize this mathematically in the form of multidimensional time. And it's the best game in town for us to have this understanding of the unity of consciousness from a rigorous scientific perspective. Hopefully, Bernard will have, and this is a project for more than one lifetime. Hopefully, Bernard will get people who will continue this after him. I mean, he has the pedigree. He was Stephen Hawking's very first graduate student. He lived with Stephen Hawking when Stephen started getting ill. I mean, there's an actor that plays Bernard Carr in the movie The Theory of Everything. He has the pedigree, so he's impossible to not take seriously. So hopefully he can cultivate this respect he has to attract people that can give follow-up to the work he's doing.
Right. Should we get back on track and to the implications? Rupert, at the start you spoke, obviously we've touched on how we feel and think ourselves, and then also how we relate, even in extreme cases as the one we spoke about earlier. And then you spoke about nature and a relationship to nature and to animals and so forth. Could you dive a bit deeper into that one?
Yes, well, in relation to animals, you just have to imagine, and it's good to do this with people as well. You have to imagine and feel that you are literally the animal, that it is yourself. Because if what Bernardo has just said, if what we're all suggesting is that the self of all people and animals, the being, the essential core sense of self or subjectivity is the same, then this means that literally, not metaphorically, but literally, the animal in this case we're talking about, the animal is ourself. So put yourself in the position of the animal. I am that cat. I am that fish. I am that cow. How would I want to be treated? Well, that's how we should treat it. Why? Because if we ask ourselves, how do I want to be treated? Would anyone say, I want to be treated with cruelty, with injustice, with unkindness, with violence? No, no one would say that about themselves. Why do we feel justified in believing that about someone else or another animal? Only because we consider them to be different from, separate from ourselves. As soon as we imagine a person or an animal to be separate from ourselves, that enables us, it gives us permission to behave towards them in a way that we would never countenance another behaving towards us. Why? It's just because we feel we are separate from them. You remove that feeling of separation and you feel, I am that other person, then we then treat the other person, the animal in this case, as we would want to be treated. That would govern. It would revolutionize the way we treat animals, or it would revolutionize the way we treat humans. Take sorry, I'm straying a little bit from your question, Simon. Take politics, for instance. The implication of this understanding is not that we would all agree on all policies. That's not implied. But there are still legitimate different ways where that a society can be legitimately governed and function. But it does mean that politicians, imagine if a politician were to have this understanding and they were to feel that not only everybody in the country, but everyone, not only everyone in their party, but everyone in the opposite party was the same self, not the similar self, the same self that they knew themselves to be. And they allowed that single felt understanding to inform the dialogue. Think of the quality, think of how creative our politics would be. There would be differences. There should be differences, because that's how we debate, that's how we grow, that's how we change, that's our new policies. There should be differences and disagreements. But think of they would be creative. The differences would be the source of creativity and the means by which new policies were brought into society that better served everybody. So this understanding would have profound implications for the way we treat animals, the way we do politics, our educational system, our medical system, as Bernardo hinted earlier, and indeed it would have a profound impact on the way we treat our environment, because we would literally feel that the environment is part of the same being that we are. We would work in harmony with it. We would never see it as something to be exploited and degraded. We would see it in the same way that people treat their gardens. Why is it that everyone treats their gardens or their pot plants with love and care? But as a whole, we trash nature. Why not extend? And it's just the same way that we all treat our nearest and dearest, our friends and our family, with love, but not our enemies. Well, why we should just extend the love we feel to our friends and family to everyone, and we should extend the love and the care we nurture our pot plants or our garden to the whole of nature. Think of how that would transform our relationship with the environment.
Rupert, I can't add to what you just said or do it any better. There is another thing that is often present in my mind. I just wanted to share that with you and see what you have to say about it. And that's the sense of mystery, which I think we lost under this narrative that the world is fundamentally physical, and therefore it is just what it seems to be. There is nothing behind it. There is no dimension of depth and mystery behind the appearances. The appearances are the things in themselves, which is the narrative of physicalism, um, which makes the world shallow and flat and devoid of meaning in a semantic sense, in the sense that physical things don't point beyond themselves. They are supposed to be their own meaning, instead of pointers or symbols that point beyond themselves. Just like words point beyond themselves. If I say tree, you experience more than just the sound tree. You experience the tree that the sound is pointing to. And under this understanding that physicality is just what transpersonal mental processes out there look like when we observe or measure those transpersonal mental processes. They are images on a dashboard and not the thing that is measured. If you understand that, at least in my own experience of this understanding, the world immediately acquires an extra dimension of depth and mystery, because now everything is a suggestion. No element of the physical world is the thing in itself, is the end of the story. They are all pointers. They are like a set of symbols to be interpreted, to be understood, to be deciphered, almost. There is this quote by Nisargadatta Maharaj that always stuck to my mind, answering to a question from a disciple. He said, to see the world is to see God. There is no seeing God other than the world. To see God beyond the world is to be God. I mean, he just brought it down to as few words that it can possibly brought down, and explained it so lucidly, so clearly, meaning that the world is what God looks like when observed from our finite perspective.
Yes. Yes.
And therefore it acquires this tremendous new dimension of mystery. What is the world betraying about the mind of God? betraying the sense of revealing indirectly, or suggesting, or pointing to. And to me, this has had the effect of removing the existential claustrophobian aspect of being in the world. It has made the world much larger. I feel like a kid in kermis. Lots of things to explore, lots of things to see, unending mystery.
Yeah.
I don't know how you relate to this. This is not something I see talked about a lot in non-duality circles.
Yes. I think that if we take appearances at face value and think that things, objects have their own existence, then we posit reality behind those appearances. Just like for one who takes the drama in a movie for real, we might say, no, the reality of the drama, the screen, lies behind the movie. It is and can't be found in the movie, and is as such in relation to the things in the movie. The screen is mysterious. You cannot find it anywhere in the movie. It lies behind it. It is veiled by it. So from this we get the idea that reality is concealed by the world, that it is veiled by the world. And I know that, Bernardo, that this is not what it's not all you're saying. You would say that, but you would then qualify it. I understand that. And I think, and this is very often how the non-dual traditions, or certainly the traditions that I've been brought up in, the Vedantic and Tantric traditions, they first start by suggesting that the world veils its reality, that reality lies somehow behind the world and as such cannot be found in the world. In that sense, it is mysterious. But the idea of being a mystery in that context is predicated on the belief that the world is a world made of physical things. Therefore, its reality is mysterious and somehow lies behind it. But in order for that idea of mystery to hold up, we must credit the world with its own existence, veiling reality. Now imagine that we didn't start with that. Why? Because, as we all understand and agree, that there isn't a physical world. That the physical world is how reality, God's being, infinite consciousness appears from our localized perspective. So let's not start from appearances and work back towards reality. We've done that. We've been doing that for years. Let's remove all that. Let's start with reality.
Right.
And so, from the point of view of reality, there is nothing that is not reality. So there's no question of reality ever being veiled, because it could only be veiled by something that was other than itself. And if it was other than itself, it would not be real, and therefore could not exist. In just the same way that for someone who is lost in the content of a movie, we might say, to begin with, as a concession to their being lost in the movie, we might say the screen lies behind the movie and is veiled by it. No, that's a concession to their belief that the landscape in the movie is real. So let's start with the screen. You start with the screen. There's no question of the screen being veiled by the movie, because all there is to the movie is the screen. The screen cannot veil itself with itself. It could only veil itself with something other than itself. And how can something other than the screen appear on the screen? So if we start with reality, there's no question of the world concealing reality. It is a revelation of it is the shining of reality, albeit a one that is limited to our particular perspective of it. I'm not saying that all there is to reality appears as the world, but whatever it is that appears as the world is that reality. And in that sense, what I'm heading with this is that it's not reality that is mysterious. Reality is staring itself in the face all the time. It is the world as it is normally conceived that is mysterious. So mysterious, in fact, that nobody has ever found it. So so from this point of view, it's so difficult for us for those of us that have come from this materialist model and slowly replaced our understanding with this non-dual understanding, but to literally walk around the streets, not intellectually feeling that the reality of what we see lies behind, but that literally what we are experiencing as the world is God's infinite being, is the activity, the movement of infinite consciousness, and to feel it as that. Then we would not feel that there was a mystery behind the world, but that the world itself was imbued with meaning and significance, not some other meaning, not that it's pointing to something other than itself, but that it is itself. And I'm sure nearly everyone has had this experience. Listening to music, it often happens with me, or visually as well, where you feel that the world itself is just pregnant with significance. Its meaning doesn't lie beyond it or behind it. It is its meaning. It is only our reducing it to physical stuff that denies its meaning, and we then have to posit its meaning somehow behind it.
Do you see the world as having also a sort of first-person perspective to its own existence? In what Nisargadatta said, like the only way to know God beyond the world is to be God. So he was appealing to the first-person perspective of the
Yes,
world.
I think there is a first-person perspective, not a first-person perspective of the world, but a first-person perspective of reality. That would be consciousness's knowledge of itself.
Right.
But I don't think there is any objective experience in that.
How do you mean objective experience?
There's no that consciousness experience, or the only way to know God is to be God. God's experience of itself, or infinite consciousness's experience of itself, I would suggest is devoid of any content. In other words, because in order to know content needs to be known from a point of view. In order to know something objective, it has to be known by from a point of view.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, if the world could be known by infinite consciousness, at the moment the world is known from the perspectives of each of our finite minds. It is known from a localized perspective. But imagine if infinite consciousness were able to perceive the world directly, not mediated through each of our minds. It would perceive the world from every possible point in space simultaneously. That would how would that appear? The deepest, darkest black you could imagine. In order to experience a thing, something that has form and shape, consciousness needs to localize itself and view that thing from a point of view. So does infinite consciousness have direct experience of content independent of a finite mind? I would say not. In other words,
When I think,
sorry.
go ahead.
In other words, the universe's experience of itself, or reality's experience of itself, God's experience of itself, is formless. It does have a first-person perspective, but it is formless. In order to experience form, I think consciousness has to refract itself into each of our finite minds, and it is only from the perspective of a finite mind that it is able to see the inside of its own mind in form.
Would it be conceivable that its own first-person experience of itself, although having no objects with forms, in other words, not entailing perception of objects out there, would it entail endogenous experiences of the kind of same kind of experience as a human emotion or a human abstract thought? Because these experiences don't have form, they are not things, they are just states of mind, but they are still experiential.
Yes, but when I use the word form in this context, I mean anything, including any endogenous experience, an emotion. I mean anything that really anything that can be described, or so. But for instance, even an emotion. I know you're not implying that God's mind, infinite consciousness, has human emotions. I understand that's not what you're saying, but even an emotion, take the emotion of sadness. It's only possible to experience sadness from the vantage point of an individual. The whole could not feel sadness.
But it does have a first-person perspective.
It has it is self-aware. It has a first-person perspective, but all it knows is itself. It doesn't know anything other than its own formless being. In order to know something limited, in other words, from another.
I'm following you. I am following you.
In order to know something limited, the infinite must contract into a finite mind. The infinite cannot know the finite. The infinite can only know the infinite. The finite can only be known not by a finite mind, but from the perspective of a finite mind.
So the infinite could not have a discernible experience that we could attach a label to and say,
yes,
there is experience A and there is experience B.
Yes. Yes. Experience A and experience B would only be possible from a localized perspective.
But there is still something it is like to be the infinite.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. And we know what that experience is. Our experience of simply being, in other words, the awareness of being, is that experience. In fact, I would say that the awareness of being is not a finite mind's knowledge of itself. It is infinite consciousness's knowledge of itself in us.
Yeah. So what I meant was with this, or by the idea of an extra dimension of depth, is that there is something it is like to be the world. And it is mysterious because we can't put a label on it. It's so beyond the human understanding of what an experience of self could be. But what you are saying is that it's not really a mystery because it's also in us. What is behind the world is in ourselves as well, and it can be known through introspection, if I understood you correctly.
No, I think that's not what I'm saying. You see, I don't think there is something that it is like to be the world. But I would go further. I don't think there is something that it is like to be a person. If you were to
now you lost me.
Okay, close. Can we do this experientially, not philosophically? Okay, close your eyes. Now, whatever our self is present now. Therefore, we do not have to refer to our past to gather knowledge about ourselves. So remove your past. Don't refer to your past. And describe your experience of yourself now. But Bernardo, if you were to describe your experience of yourself now without reference to your past, this is the first experience you've ever had. How would you describe yourself?
Pure subjectivity, sort of a field of awareness without any content.
Exactly. Right. There you are. You didn't describe being a person. In other words, you don't have the experience of being a person. You have the experience of being.
Totally with you there.
So if we don't even have the experience of being a person, I would suggest the idea of being a person is something that is added to our core awareness of being. I would say the same thing happens at a larger scale for infinite consciousness. I don't think there's any experience of being the world. I think there is the experience of being itself, which is identical to our experience of simply being. In other words, just then when you paused and I asked you the question, describe yourself, right then, that was infinite awareness's, infinite consciousness's experience of itself that you were describing.
I understand you. I think there were some terminology differences that.
Okay.
So let me try to explain better what I meant. I mean, you did enlighten me right now. I have a better understanding now than I had before. But what I meant by the experience of being the world was the experience of being what we call or conceptualize as the world, whatever that actually is
Yes.
in and of itself.
Yes.
And
That I
and
would
the
agree with.
experience. So that's what I meant. And the experience I just had through pure introspection, guided by you, was an experience of emptiness, but it was not no experience. There
Exactly.
was
Yes.
something it was like to be that emptiness. That's what I
Absolutely.
meant
Yes.
by
I,
there being something it is like.
yes. No, I totally agree. There is something it is like to be the reality of the world. I think that's what you mean. Whatever the world
Yes.
really is, there is something that it is like to be that. Absolutely. Yes. No, sorry, maybe I misunderstood you. When you said, is there something it is like to be the world? I thought you meant, is there something it is like to be the world as we perceive it? No.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's not what I meant.
No, I
No.
agree. I agree. And what it is like to be the reality of the world is exactly the same as what it is like to be the reality of ourself as a person, which we all just
Yeah, that's
experience.
the thing. Yeah, that's the thing you added to my understanding. That actually it's very consistent with what Schopenhauer himself did. He said we do have a way to
Ex-
know the thing in itself, and
exactly.
that's,
Yeah.
yeah, through introspection.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is why Schopenhauer went further than Kant, who said we can only know the world through perception. That would be true if it were not for one experience, the knowing of being, the awareness of being. That's the only experience there is that is not mediated through thought or perception. And it gives us direct access to the reality of the world.
But still, Rupert, but I understand you now. Um, the world we see. I mean, let's disconsider living beings for now, because we know they have their own contents of experience, so to say. If we stay then with what we could call the inanimate universe as a whole, that image, that appearance that we see is dynamic. It's rich. Stars go supernova, galaxies form, volcanoes erupt, tropical storms happen. Um, there is so much variety. There are so many different states and so many dynamisms. And now I'm asking from my intellectual mind now. How can so much dynamism, so much variety be the appearance of a pure non-dynamical inner state?
I think it's not non-dynamical. I think it is dynamic, and its movement is what appears to us as the universe. But I don't think it can experience its own dynamic states without being mediated through a finite mind. Because if it were to experience its own dynamism from its own point of view, unmediated, it would have to experience it from every conceivable point of view simultaneously. In order to experience something with form, it has to separate itself from that thing as some kind of localized mind. I don't mean a human mind necessarily. I'm open to the possibility that there might be other kinds of mind. But there would have to be some kind of finite mind from whose perspective this finite dynamism is perceived, that it couldn't perceive it directly.
So is the implication that in some sense, the dynamism of the universe is something we create by observing it?
No, I don't think we create it. I think the dynamism of the universe is, I think it's inherent in the ultimate reality. In other words, I don't think the ultimate reality is just a motionless field. I think its nature is to move within itself. And indeed, each of our finite minds is a form of its own movement, a form of its own vibration. But it doesn't experience, I would suggest it cannot experience its own dynamism directly as something without experiencing it from a point of view.
But then what is that dynamism if it's not its own
No,
experience?
it's its own. It's a movement of itself, but it is not. It doesn't experience that movement in subject-object relationship. In order
Ah, I
to
understand you.
experience anything objective, it has to be. You can't have an object without a subject. You can't have one side of a coin.
Yeah, yeah. It's not metacognitive of that dynamism. That would be.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. Exactly. Yes.
I understand you now. So those dynamisms are entirely spontaneous.
They're spontaneous. They're natural. They precede and are independent of their being observed by a finite mind.
Right.
But they are not observed by infinite consciousness. In order to be observed, they have to be observed from the perspective of a finite mind.
Yeah. So they are not in Schopenhauerian language. They are not represented
They're not
by
represented
the finite mind.
by finite mind or to the infinite mind. They don't appear. They're not.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's what I meant. They are not represented by the infinite mind itself.
Exactly.
So they're not metacognitive. They are spontaneous things of an experiential nature, but not a object-subject experience of the kind we have
Yes.
because we metacognize.
Yes. Exactly.
I understand you.
Yes.
So, but okay, to me, that is still a dimension of mystery, and it may be a mystery even from its own perspective.
Yes.
Do you see what I mean?
Absolutely. No, I agree. As I think I said, I don't think that all that is I don't think that our world is the appearance of the entirety of reality. It is
Oh,
only
absolutely
it
not.
is only
Yeah.
that aspect of reality that can be captured within the very narrow capacities of our finite mind. So yes, the activity of infinite consciousness is very much more than captured by our perceiving faculties and is mysterious. Yes, absolutely.
But even the parts that are captured, if they reflect inherent dynamisms of infinite consciousness that are not accessible metacognitively to infinite consciousness itself, isn't there a sense in which there is a mystery there, even from infinite consciousness' own point of view? You see what I'm trying to hint at?
Yes,
It may be very little and insignificant from your perspective, which I would understand, but I am the one that considers the breadcrumbs a meal. So
yes,
these breadcrumbs for me, I make a meal out of it, if you know what I mean.
yes. No, I think all I was trying to say, I was addressing an earlier stage of understanding, which we've now moved beyond, that considers the world a concealing of reality, and that
Oh, I don't mean that at all.
yeah, okay. So I was so that's what I was referring to when I said the reality of the universe is not, it's not a mystery. It's staring itself
Yes.
in the face all the time. But yes, I would absolutely agree that there is very much more to the activity of consciousness than presents itself to our finite mind as the world, and
Yeah, I didn't mean.
and that and that somehow the world yes, it shines with that mystery, When you look at the world, it indicates something of that mystery. Yes.
I didn't mean, and I think that this is important to clarify. I didn't mean that the world, in any sense, expressly conceals
Yes.
something.
Yes.
I didn't mean that this is a premeditated mystery novel written to foment our sense of mystery. No, the world presents itself the way it does because it just does what it's doing. There is no effort to conceal. There is no effort to deception. A metaphor to explain this would be the following. Um, Anybody who looks at the sun, going from horizon to horizon, from east to west, might say, why is nature deceiving me by pretending that the sun is orbiting the earth? No, there is no deception. The sun going from horizon to horizon is exactly what you would expect to see if the earth orbits the sun and not the other way around. So there is no deception here, there is only a false account.
Yes.
And the false
Yeah.
account is that the sun orbits the earth,
Exactly.
while what's happening is the other way around. The sun is not deceiving us
Yeah.
by going from horizon to horizon. That appearance is exactly what you would expect if the earth goes and orbits the sun, which is what is in fact the case. So I would apply the same thing to the world. The world is what it is, not because it's trying to deceive us. It's just being what it is. And it looks exactly like what it would look like given the truth of the matter, just like the sun going from horizon to horizon. But we have a false account of it.
Yes.
And our false account is that those appearances are all there is. There is nothing behind the appearances. There is nothing the appearances are appearances of. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's what I meant by this claustrophobic and
Yes. I understand.
claustrophobia inducing false account
Yes.
of what's going on, not because it's a deception or an effort to conceal, but because we produced a false account. And when I personally got rid of that false account, me personal experience was one of expansion. It's like opening the window in a dark, musty room with vitiated air. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, there's space again, and that dimension of mystery, to me at least, was quite liberating.
Yes. Yeah.
Does it make sense to you what I just said?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
I know I may be making a meal out of breadcrumbs, and you're interested in going beyond that.
No,
But
not at all. Not at all. It's good. We're using a microscope now and we're just exploring just any slight differences between our points of view. And actually, the more we put them under the microscope, the less distinction there is. But we're using words. We're really pushing words to their limit, so it's necessary to clarify these little.
yeah, and society doesn't do that like we are doing now. So imagine the level of misunderstanding.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's what's so beautiful about these conversations. They're rare. There's not many contexts in which it's possible to have this conversation. I just wanted to just say one thing, just to go back about the activity of infinite consciousness, which only appears as form from the localized perspective of each of our minds. I would. The evolution of the finite mind, start with infinite consciousness, it moves within itself, it's not experiencing its own dynamism directly. I would suggest that the finite mind was part of that movement. It's not, and of course I know very well that you understand this, the finite mind is not separate from that movement. It is an evolution of that movement through which infinite consciousness is able not to know itself, because it knows itself without the aid of a finite mind, but it is the means by which it is able to perceive its own activity in form. It is in other words, it is part of its return journey. So it vibrates within itself. It eventually coalesces into a finite mind, and it is through the agency of that finite mind, which is a a localization of its own activity through which it is able to look back on itself at its own interior life, not to know itself because it knows itself directly, but to know the content of its activity, that the finite mind is part of that evolution.
Totally there with you. Usually that's what I mean when I talk about the telos of nature.
Exactly. Yes.
That return, that enriched return. And I understand what you're saying now. When you say it experiences itself directly, it's what I normally refer to when I say it has a spontaneous experience of itself and non-metacognitive experience of itself. In other
Yes.
words, it's a direct experience without the split into subject and object.
Yes. Its knowledge of itself is not something that it does. It is its nature to know itself. It's self-conscious by nature. It's not. It doesn't have to reflect on itself.
Yeah.
The same reason that the sun illuminates itself simply by being itself. It's not something it does. It's what it is. It is its nature to know itself. Yes. Yes.
Is that
I'm totally with you. Not that it matters that I'm totally with you, but yes, I'm totally with you. I understand what you are trying to say.
But I think it doesn't matter. But I think it's significant, Bernardo, because you and I, we our paths are we operate in different fields. We have different audiences, but there's an increasing overlap between them. And I think it is significant that you and I have both come to this understanding through very different channels. And I think it is significant the degree of agreement between us, and that particularly as we put our understanding, both of our understandings, such as they are, under the microscope, I think it is very interesting and significant how much that we converge more and more and more. It's not only beautiful, I think it's significant.
For me, it's a delight because I've come to take you as a sort of a litmus test. So it gives me a lot of reassurance to see this convergence. I think this year we've realized that we converge more than we thought even last year.
More than we thought. And I'm touched that you say that, Bernardo, but it's also significant for me because, as you know, you've come through empirical evidence and reason. I've come through introspection and reason. So we both overlap with the reason, but I haven't explored empirical evidence, although you have explored in introspection to a degree. So it's in other words, it's significant to me that you're, from the perspective of empirical evidence, that you are validating the deepest insights that I've come to through introspection and reason. So
the grass is always greener at the end. Right? I mean, for me, introspection is the royal avenue to knowledge, and it's exactly my weak point. So, but I understand what you're saying.
Well, going back to the beginning of our conversation, not the beginning, that beautiful discussion in the middle of the conversation about different mind, different people being thoughts in the same mind, taking place simultaneously rather than sequentially. Given that point of view, your mind and my mind, Bernardo, they are the same mind. It would be uneconomical for them both to explore exactly the same territory. It's not necessary for two minds. So our minds are exploring two different regions of the same territory, and comparing notes and
comparing notes.
Yeah,
that's for me. It's very reassuring.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll chip in here. Just I'm conscious of time, so actually, perhaps if we look to wrap things up shortly, two things. First of all, what you were just talking about there. Am I right in saying it's kind of the difference between phenomenal consciousness and meta-consciousness, Bernardo?
In the way we normally define the terms in analytic philosophy and psychology today, yes, there is a difference. Phenomenal consciousness does not necessarily entail the subject-object separation. It does not require higher level mental functions such as metacognition. And meta-consciousness does. So what's the difference? It's the difference between having an experience and knowing that one has the experience. So, for instance, you are constantly experiencing your breathing, the air flowing in and out of your nostrils. You're constantly experiencing your blinking, your eyelids going down, going up and down, but you're not metacognitive of those experiences because you're not bringing your attention to them. So you experience them, Rupert would say, directly, but without the subject-object separation. And therefore, from the point of view of meta-consciousness, it is as if they weren't experienced at all. Because from the point of view of meta-consciousness, an experience only exists once it is internally re-represented. The knowledge of the experience is that re-representation, which is itself experiential, but it's a plus. It's something that's added on top of the initial purely spontaneous experience. So if the intrinsic dynamism and movement of the universal mind is not internally re-represented, then there is a very, very, very strong sense in which the universal mind doesn't know it. It just doesn't know it. It's not available to to um, to examination.
Right. Which is sort of consciousness's knowledge of itself in its purest form. It is
Yeah, Rupert does maintain, and I agree with him, that consciousness knows itself directly merely by the fact that it is consciousness. I mean, consciousness is the only thing that merely by being conscious can be said to know itself by acquaintance.
but in a way, it doesn't
Um,
know that it knows itself.
but it doesn't know that it knows itself.
Right.
That would be the metacognition.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Fine. Okay. Right. Last thing then. Obviously, we were talking about the implications, and we've touched on that on occasion throughout this conversation. And Rupert, you spoke about how we would treat animals, how we would treat nature, how governments would behave if politicians came from this understanding. And I wonder how inclined you would be to both be able to perhaps paint a bit of a vision then, because the way I see the world currently, taking each of them in turn, perhaps government, politicians, and I hate to generalize, and perhaps this is more of a modern phenomenon, but it seems to be actually be a magnet for egoic pursuit to a degree and for power. And maybe, and I don't think it's always been that way, and maybe I'm a bit biased in saying that, but it seems that way, certainly in a sizable part. Then, of course, we have climate change, and we talk about the Ukraine and the danger there, but the threat of climate change, and then also the way we treat animals, and the fact that even just the fact that animals make up such a huge part of the human diet, for example. So if there was that tipping point, if this understanding became had reached that point where it was pervasive, what would be a vision for how things could be or should be?
I think there are two basic implications how things would be. We would feel that at the deep in the core of our being, we would feel fulfilled, at peace, the absence of the sense of lack, and this would have a profound effect on our consumer society. The vast majority of people's actions, that their activities, that their desire for objects, for substances, for activities, for relationship, is as a means to fulfill themselves, put an end to the sense of lack. And our consumer society, for instance, is based on this single principle, that the foundation of the separate self or the ego, there is this sense of lack, this voracious sense of needing something, an object, a substance, an activity. And our economy is driven by this single principle. Now imagine if that sense of lack were to come to an end. It doesn't mean that we would not need things. We don't cease needing food and shelter but imagine if the majority of our lives was no longer motivated by the need to get rid of the sense of lack, this existential sense of lack that lives at the core of ourself. How would that affect our relationship with objects, substances, activities? That would have a profound effect on society. And so that would be one implication. The second implication is that conflict between individuals, communities, and nations would be dramatically reduced. It doesn't mean to say that we would all agree with each other. There would still be differences, but the way we resolve those differences would be informed by our primary understanding that at the deepest level, we are one with the other. And so there'd be a dramatic reduction in conflicts individually, nationally, internationally, and a dramatic decrease in the sense of lack and our compulsive behaviors whose purpose is to alleviate ourselves from its discomfort.
Bernardo, just before I ask for your take on it, so just a couple of, I don't want to sound trite or anything, but for example, would the eating of meat become just totally out of the question?
You're asking me?
I'll actually ask you, Rupert, and then I want to come to you for a more broader, your vision as well, if I may.
Yeah.
Simon, I never feel that it's up to me to dictate the way people behave. The way we behave is an expression of our understanding. So the strata of experience that I'm interested in is our deepest understanding. And that's what I've explored, that's what I'm interested in, that's what I like to speak and write about. How each of us expresses that understanding in our lives, I'm reluctant to dictate, because perhaps most of all, because I have a respect for freedom. Why? Because freedom is our nature. So I think it's more important to explore the deepest elements of our experience, and then to allow people to behave as they see fit. I can't improve on St. Augustine. When he was asked the same question, he answered, "Love and do whatever you want."
Yeah.
Realize your prior unity with everyone and everything. And once you realize that, just behave in a way that is consistent with that understanding.
I had a hunch that was coming just as you were building towards that, actually. Bernardo, what about you? Let's finish with your vision of how things could be.
I'll just talk more around what Rupert already said, for what it's worth, maybe bring different words to it. Rupert mentioned both of the things I'm going to state now. I think there are two key problems we have now that are a direct consequence of a false account of what we observe, a false account of what's going on. It's like the account that the sun is orbiting the earth. The universe is not deceiving us. It's just that we have a false account of it. And that false account has many consequences, but two significant ones. One is we replace reality with abstraction. And the second is we react to our gargantuan sense of existential lack, the lack of meaning, through addictive patterns of behavior. So it's addiction and abstraction. I think these are the two things that are behind a lot of the problems, a lot of the suffering. Abstraction, you see a glaring example today. When one abstracts away from the felt reality of human experience, the suffering of the people, when one abstracts away from that and concludes that there is a state that is above and beyond its own people, that the state has a sort of ontic status that is not only independent of the people, it's above the direct experience of the people. When that abstraction replaces the reality of individual suffering, you have what's going on in Ukraine. When Mother Russia or the Slavic Empire, as a pure abstraction, because there is nothing to it but the people, the Slavic people, and their experiences, when that abstraction replaces reality, then we have a problem. I hear an echo. Are you
Yeah, I hear
are you
that.
hearing?
I don't know why that is, but and
I'll
if it's not
continue.
coming out of yours, Bernardo, then
I'm not
certainly
hearing
in the
it.
edit, you can't hear anything. Well, I'm sure it'll be tidied up in the edit. Sorry, carry on.
Okay. The other one are the patterns of addiction. Rupert already discussed this. If we don't see meaning in our lives, if we think that our lives are about us, but because the only thing that exists is this abstraction called matter outside and independent of experience, then the only possible meaning of life is to accumulate matter, because that's the only thing that exists. And of course, that doesn't fulfill our primary sense of meaning, because it's an outright contradiction with truth, with reality. And therefore, we have this black hole in the middle of our chests that we try to cover through patterns of addiction, like eating meat. And now I'll stick my neck out a little more, like eating meat, eating sugar, like dominating people around you and having your way, having things your way, buying stuff compulsively, like having 32 pairs of shoes. I mean, can you wear them all? Addiction to money, even if you don't know how to spend it, because it's a symbol for power. And power, the will to power of Nietzsche, is the normal reaction to somebody who is disconnected from reality and feels that sense of lack, that sense of an absence of meaning in the middle of one's chest. And it is this natural addictive response to a false account that leads to the patterns of behavior that are so destructive to the environment today, the accumulation of material goods, the extraordinary consumption of meat and sugar, the need to exert power over other human beings and to be more powerful and to have more money. These patterns that are bringing the earth to the brink of a systemic collapse. And I agree with Rupert. If we are grounded in reality, I mean, we are always in reality. We cannot escape reality. We are part of it. We are always surrounded by it. But when we cognitively dissociate from it by creating an internal narrative, an abstraction that replaces reality, this is what leads to these patterns of behaviors. And if we truly reground ourselves and we feel the reality that we are expressions of nature and that our role is to serve nature and not get in the way of it, and that freedom is the basic set of circumstances that we need to perform that role, um, and that life has meaning regardless of whether we understand it or not. It's pregnant with meaning. It's bursting at the seams with meaning. If if that reality that is always there is again felt and not interrupted by a false account, not obscured by a false abstraction, then those addictive patterns of behavior will naturally disappear. They will by themselves. It's like butter melting under the sun. It requires no effort. It just happens. And one will never put the reality of human experience below and subjugate it to an insane abstraction like a state that is above and beyond ontologically than the experience of its own people. Conflict will be reduced. So, yeah.
And
I said the same things Rupert said with my own words,
yes,
for what it's
no,
worth.
and it was lovely to hear. And things would naturally then get back into balance, as it were. Yeah.
Effortlessly. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Well, that I think is a lovely place to leave it. Thank you very much to both of you again. At the beginning, Rupert, you spoke about, or we spoke about, sort of the opening of the heart and the feeling. And I have reflected as we've I've been listening to you a lot, and I've very much experienced that during this conversation. It's such a joy and it's such a privilege. So just lovely to speak to you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Bernardo. It's a privilege for me to. I think these conversations we have, they're rare. To be able to speak like this and to be able to speak in this depth and with this much understanding, it's beautiful. So thank you both.
It's been a great privilege for me too, Rupert. And I'm sure we don't use the word privilege in that sense, but it has become sort of cliche. We don't mean it that way. I have learned new things today. For me, it's truly a privilege to have been here with the two of you.
Well, thank you very much. And perhaps one day there'll be a part 3. It's always nice to round out a trilogy. But in the meantime, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for listening and watching.
Bye-bye.